Chapter 8. The Tortoise Hills. Behind the villa there was a series of small hills that raised shaggy crests above the surrounding olive groves. They were hills covered with great beds of green myrtle, tall heather, and a patchy feathering of cypress trees. This was probably the most fascinating area of the whole garden, for it was overflowing with life. In the sandy paths, the antlion larvae dug their little cone-shaped pits and lay in wait to spatter any unwary ant that stepped over the edge with a bombardment of sand that would send it tumbling down to the bottom of the trap, to be seized in the antlion larva's terrible pincer-like jaws. In the red sandbanks, the hunting wasps were digging their tunnels and hawking low in pursuit of spiders. They would stab them with their sting, paralyzing them, and carrying them off to serve as food for their larvae. Among the heather blooms, the great fat furry caterpillars of emperor moths fed slowly, looking like animated fur collars. Among the myrtles in the warm scented twilight of their leaves, the mantids prowled, heads turning this way and that as they watched for prey. Among the cypress branches, the chaffinches had their neat nests full of gawping, goggle-eyed babies, and on the lower branches the goldcrests weaved their tiny fragile cups of moss and hair, or foraged for insects, hanging upside down on the ends of the branches, giving almost inaudible squeaks of joy at the discovery of a tiny spider or a gnat, their golden crests gleaming like little forage caps as they flipped daintily through the gloom of the tree. It was not long after we arrived at the villa that I discovered these hills really belonged to the tortoises. One hot afternoon, Roger and I were concealed behind a bush, waiting patiently for a large swallowtail butterfly to return to its favourite sunning patch so that we might capture it. It was the first really hot day we'd had that year, and everything seemed to be lying drugged and asleep, soaking up the sun. The swallowtail was in no hurry. He was down by the olive groves doing a ballet dance by himself, twisting, diving, pirouetting in the sun. As we watched him, I saw, from the corner of my eye, a faint movement at one side of the bush where we were sheltering. I glanced quickly to see what it was, but the brown earth was sun-drenched and empty of life. I was just about to turn my attention to the butterfly again when I saw something that I could hardly believe. The patch of earth I'd been looking at suddenly heaved upwards, as though pushed by a hand from beneath. The soil cracked, and a tiny seedling waved about wildly before its pale roots gave way, and it fell on its side. What, I wondered, could be the cause of this sudden eruption? An earthquake? Surely not so small and confined. A mole? Not in such dry and waterless terrain. As I was speculating, the earth gave another heave. Clods of it cracked off and rolled away, and I was looking at a brown and yellow shell. More earth was swept out of the way as the shell bucked upwards, and then, slowly and cautiously, a wrinkled, scaly head appeared out of the hole. A long, skinny neck followed it. The bleary eyes blinked once or twice as the tortoise surveyed me. Then, deciding I must be harmless, he hoisted himself with infinite care and effort out of his earthy cell, walked 2 or 3 steps, and sank down in the sunshine, drowsing gently. After the long winter under the damp and chilly soil, that first sunbath must have been like a drink of wine to the reptile. His legs were spread out from his shell, his neck extended as far as it could, his head resting on the ground, with eyes closed. The creature seemed to be absorbing sunshine through every bit of his body and shell. He remained lying there for about 10 minutes, and then he rose, slowly and deliberately, and rolled off down the path to where a patch of dandelion clover spread in the shade of a cypress. Here his legs seemed to give way, and he collapsed onto the bottom of his shell with a thump. Then his head appeared from his shell, bent slowly down towards the rich pile of the clover patch. His mouth opened wide. There was a moment's suspense, and then his mouth closed around the succulent leaves. His head jerked back to tear them off, and he sat there munching happily, his mouth stained with the first food of the year. This must have been the first tortoise of spring, and as if his appearance from the subterranean dormitory was a signal, the hills suddenly became covered with tortoises. I've never seen so many congregated in so small an area. big ones the size of a soup plate and little ones the size of a cup, coloured great-grandfathers and pale horn-coloured youngsters, all lumbering heavily along the sandy paths, in and out of the heather and myrtles, occasionally descending to the olive groves where the vegetation was more succulent. Sitting in one spot for an hour or so, you could count as many as 10 tortoises pass you, and on one afternoon, as an experiment, I collected 35 specimens in 2 hours, just walking about the hillside and picking them up as they wandered about, with an air of preoccupied determination, their club feet thumping on the ground. No sooner had the shelled owners of the hills appeared from their winter quarters and had their first meal, than the males became romantically inclined. Stalking along on tiptoe with stumbling rapidity, their necks stretched out to the fullest extent, they would set out in search of a mate, pausing now and then to give a strange yawping cry, the passionate love song of a male tortoise. The females, ambling heavily through the heather and pausing now and then for a snack, would answer in an offhand manner. 2 or 3 males, travelling at what, for a tortoise, was a gallop, would generally converge on the same female. They would arrive, out of breath and inflamed with passion, and glare at each other, their throats gulping convulsively. Then they would prepare to do battle. These battles were exciting and interesting to watch, resembling all-in wrestling more than boxing. For the combatants did not possess either speed or the physical grace to indulge in fancy footwork. The general idea was for one to charge his rival as rapidly as possible and just before impact to duck his head into his shell. The best blow was considered to be the broadside, for this gave the opportunity, by wedging yourself against your rival's shell and pushing hard, of overturning him and leaving him flapping helplessly on his back. If they couldn't manage to get in a broadside, any other part of the rival's anatomy did just as well. Charging each other, straining and pushing, their shells clattering together, occasionally taking a slow-motion bite at each other's necks or retreating into their shells with a hiss, the males would do battle. Meanwhile, the object of their frenzy would amble slowly onwards, pausing now and then for a bite to eat, apparently unconcerned by the scraping and cracking of shells behind her. On more than one occasion, these battles became so furious that a male, in a fit of misplaced enthusiasm, would deliver a broadside to his lady love by mistake. She would merely fold herself into her shell with an outraged sniff and wait patiently until the battle had passed her by. These fights seemed to me the most ill-organised and unnecessary affairs, for it was not always the strongest tortoise that won. With good terrain in his favour, a small specimen could easily overturn one twice his size. Nor indeed was it invariably one of the warriors that got the lady, for on several occasions I saw a female wander away from a pair of fighting males to be accosted by a complete stranger who had not even chipped his shell on her behalf, and go off with him quite happily. Roger and I would squat by the hour in the heather, watching the tortoise knights in their ill-fitting armour jousting for the ladies, and the contests never failed to entertain us. Sometimes we would lay bets with each other as to which one was going to win, and by the end of the summer Roger had backed so many losers that he owed me a considerable amount of money. Sometimes when the battle was very fierce, Roger would get carried away by the spirit of thing and want to join in, and I would have to restrain him. When the lady had eventually made her choice, we would follow the happy couple on their honeymoon among the myrtles and even watch, discreetly hidden behind the bushes, the final acts in the romantic drama. The wedding night, or rather day, of a tortoise is not exactly inspiring. To begin with, the female performs in a disgracefully coy manner and becomes heavily skittish in evading her bridegroom's attentions. She irritates him in this way until he's forced to adopt caveman tactics and subdues her maidenly antics with a few short, sharp broadsides. The actual sexual act was the most awkward and fumbling thing I'd ever seen. The incredibly heavy-handed and inexpert way the male would attempt to hoist himself onto the female's shell, slipping and slithering, clawing desperately for a foothold on the shiny shields, overbalancing and almost overturning, was extremely painful to watch. The urge to go and assist the poor creature was almost overwhelming, and I had the greatest difficulty in restraining myself from interference. Once a male was infinitely more bungling than usual and fell down 3 times during the mounting, and generally behaved in such an imbecile manner, I was beginning to wonder if he were going to take all summer about it. At last, more by luck than skill, he hoisted himself up, and I was just heaving a sigh of relief when the female, obviously bored by the male's inadequacy, moved a few steps towards a dandelion leaf. Her husband clawed wildly at her moving shell, but could get no foothold. He slipped off, teetered for a minute, and then rolled ignominiously over onto his back. This final blow seemed to be too much for him, because instead of trying to right himself, he simply folded himself up in his shell and lay there mournfully. The female, meanwhile, ate the dandelion leaf. At last, since his passion seemed to have died, I rolled the male over, and after a minute or so he wandered off, peering about him in a dazed fashion and ignoring his erstwhile bride, who regarded him unemotionally, her mouth full of food. As a punishment for her callous behaviour, I carried her up to the most barren and desiccated part of the hillside and left her there, so that she would have an extremely long walk to the nearest clover patch. I came to know many of the tortoises by sight, so closely and enthusiastically did I watch their daily lives. Some I could recognise by their shape and colour, others by some physical defect, a chip from the edge of their shells, the loss of a toenail, and so on. There was one large honey and tar-coloured female who was unmistakable, for she had only one eye. I got on such intimate terms with her that I christened her Madame Cyclops. She came to know me quite well, and realising that I meant her no harm, she would not disappear into her shell at my approach, but stretch up her neck to see if I had brought her a titbit in the shape of a lettuce leaf or some tiny snails, of which she was inordinately fond. She would roll about her business quite happily, while Roger and I followed her, and occasionally, as a special treat, we would carry her down to the olive groves for a picnic lunch on the clover. To my infinite regret, I was not present at her wedding, but I was lucky enough to witness the outcome of the honeymoon. I found her one day busily engaged in digging a hole in the soft soil at the base of a bank. She had dug to quite a fair depth when I arrived, and seemed glad to have a rest and a little refreshment in the shape of some clover flowers. Then she set to work once more, scraping the earth out with her forefeet and barging it to one side with her shell. Not being quite certain what she was trying to achieve, I did not attempt to help her, but merely lay on my stomach in the heather and watched. After some time, when she had excavated quite a pile of earth, she carefully scrutinized the hole from all angles and was apparently satisfied. She turned around, lowered her hind end over the hole, and sat there with a rapt look on her face, while she absent-mindedly laid 9 white eggs. I was most surprised and delighted, and congratulated her heartily on this achievement, while she gulped at me in a meditative sort of way. She then proceeded to scrape the soil back over the eggs and pat it down firmly by the simple method of standing over it and flopping down on her tummy several times. This task accomplished, she had a rest and accepted the remains of the clover blooms. I found myself in an awkward position, for I dearly wanted one of the eggs to add to my collection. I did not like to take it while she was there, for fear that she might feel insulted and perhaps dig up the remaining eggs and eat them or do something equally horrible. So I had to wait and sit patiently while she finished her snack, had a short doze, and then ambled off among the bushes. I followed her for some distance to make sure she did not turn back, and then hurried to the nest and carefully unearthed one of the eggs. It was about the size of a pigeon's, oval in shape, and with a rough, chalky shell. I patted the earth back over the nest so she would never know it had been disturbed, and carried my trophy triumphantly back to the villa. I blew the sticky yolk out of it with great care, and enshrined the shell among my natural history collection in a small glass-topped box of its own. The label, which was a nice blend of scientific and sentimental, read, "Egg of Greek tortoise, Testudo Greca, laid by Madame Cyclops." Throughout the spring and early summer, while I was studying the courtship of the tortoises, the villa was filled with an apparently endless stream of Larry's friends. No sooner had we seen one lot off and sighed with relief Then another steamer would arrive, and the line of taxis and horse carriages would hoot and clatter their way up the drive, and the house would be filled once more. Sometimes the fresh load of guests would turn up before we'd got rid of the previous group, and the chaos was indescribable. The house and garden would be dotted with poets, authors, artists, and playwrights arguing, painting, drinking, typing, and composing. Far from being the ordinary charming people that Larry had promised, they all turned out to be the most extraordinary eccentrics who were so highbrow that they had difficulty in understanding one another. One of the first to arrive was Zatopech, an Armenian poet, a short, stocky individual with a swooping eagle nose, a shoulder-length mane of silvery hair, and hands bulbous and twisted by arthritis. He arrived wearing an immense swirling black cloak and a broad-brimmed black hat, riding in a carriage piled high with wine. His voice shook the house like a sirocco as he swept into it, his cloak rippling, his arms full of bottles. He scarcely stopped talking the whole time he stayed. He talked from morning till night, drinking prodigious quantities of wine, snatching 40 winks wherever he happened to be, and rarely going to bed at all. In spite of his advanced years, he had lost none of his enthusiasm for the opposite sex, and while he treated Mother and Margot with a sort of creaking antique courtesy, no peasant girl for miles was free from his attentions. He would hobble through the olive groves after them, roaring with laughter, shouting endearments, his cloak flapping behind him, his pocket bulging with a bottle of wine. Even Lugorezia was not safe, and had her bottom pinched while she was sweeping under the sofa. This proved something of a blessing, as it made her forget her ailments for a few days and blush and giggle kittenishly whenever Zatopech appeared. Eventually, Zatopech departed as he had arrived, lying back regally in a cab, his cloak wrapped around him, shouting endearments to us as it clopped off down the drive, promising to return soon from Bosnia and bring some more wine for us. The next invasion consisted of 3 artists, Jonquil, Durant, and Michael. Jonquil looked and sounded like a cockney owl with a fringe. Durant was lank and mournful, and so nervous that he would almost jump out of his skin if you spoke to him suddenly. By contrast, Michael was a short, fat, somnambulistic little man, who looked like a well-boiled prawn with a mop of dark curly hair. These 3 had only one thing in common, and that was a desire to get some work done. Jonquil, on striding into the house for the first time, made this quite clear to a startled mother. "I didn't come for no bleeding holiday," she said severely. "I came to get some work done, so I'm not interested in picnics and such, see?" No, of course not," said Mother guiltily, as though she had been planning vast banquets among the myrtle bushes for Jonquil's benefit. "Just so long as you know," said Jonquil, "I didn't want to upset nothing, see? I just want to get some work done." So she promptly retired to the garden, clad in a bathing costume, and slept peacefully in the sun throughout her stay. Durant, he informed us, wanted to work too, but first he had to get his nerve back. He was shattered, he told us, quite shattered by his recent experience. Apparently, while in Italy, he had been suddenly seized with the desire to paint a masterpiece. After much thought, he decided that an almond orchard in full bloom should give a certain scope to his brush. He spent considerable time and money driving about the countryside in search of the right orchard. At long last, he found the perfect one. The setting was magnificent, and the blooms were full and thick. Feverishly he had set to work, and by the end of the first day he'd got the basis down on canvas. Tired but satisfied, he packed up his things and returned to the village. After a good night's sleep, he awoke refreshed and invigorated and rushed back to the orchard to complete his picture. On arrival there, he was struck dumb with horror and amazement, for every tree was gaunt and bare, while the ground was thickly carpeted with pink and white petals. Apparently, during the night, a spring storm had playfully stripped all the orchards in the vicinity of their blossom, including Durant's special one. "I was stricken," he told us, his voice quivering, his eyes filled with tears. "I swore I would never paint again, never. But slowly I am recovering my nerves. I am feeling less shattered. Sometime I will start to paint again." On inquiry, It turned out that this unfortunate experience had taken place 2 years previously, and Durant had still not recovered from it. Michael got off to a bad start. He was captivated by the colouring of the island and told us enthusiastically that he would begin work on an immense canvas that would capture the very essence of Corfu. He could hardly wait to start. It was most unfortunate that he happened to be prey to asthma. It was equally unfortunate that Lugarezzi had placed on a chair in his room a blanket which I used for horse riding, there being no saddles available. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by a noise that sounded like a troop of bloodhounds being slowly strangled. Assembling sleepily in Michael's room, we found him wheezing and gasping, the sweat running down his face. While Margot rushed to make some tea, Larry to get some brandy, and Leslie opened the windows, Mother put Michael back to bed, and since he was now clammy with sweat, tenderly covered him with the horse blanket. To our surprise, in spite of all remedies, he got worse. While he could still speak, we questioned him interestedly about his complaint and its cause. Psychological, purely psychological, said Larry. What does the wheezing sound remind you of? Michael shook his head mutely. I think he ought to sniff something up, something like ammonia or something, said Margot. It's wonderful if you're going to faint. Well, he's not going to faint, said Leslie tersely, but he probably would if he sniffed ammonia. Yes, dear, it is a bit strong, said Mother. I wonder what could have brought it on. Are you allergic to something, Michael? Between gasps, Michael informed us that he was only allergic to 3 things: the pollen of the lilac flower, cats, and horses. We all peered out of the window, but there was not a lilac tree for miles. We searched the room, but there was no cat hidden anywhere. I indignantly denied Larry's accusation that I'd smuggled a horse into the house. It was only when Michael seemed on the verge of death that we noticed the horse rug, which Mother had carefully tucked under his chin. The incident had such a bad effect on the poor man that he was quite unable to put a brush to canvas during his stay. He and Durant lay side by side in deck chairs, recovering their nerve together. While we were still coping with these 3, another guest arrived in the shape of Melanie, Countess de Toro. She was tall, thin, with a face like an ancient horse, crow-black eyebrows, and an enormous cushion of scarlet hair on her head. She'd hardly been in the house 5 minutes before she complained of the heat, and to Mother's consternation and my delight, she caught hold of her scarlet hair and removed it, revealing a head as bald as a mushroom top. Seeing Mother's startled gaze, the Countess explained in her harsh, croaking voice, I've just recovered from erysipelas, she said. Lost all my hair. Couldn't find eyebrows and wig to match in Milan. Might get something in Athens. It was unfortunate that, owing to a slight impediment due to ill-fitting false teeth, the Countess was inclined to mumble, so Mother was under the impression that the disease she'd just recovered from was of a much more unladylike character. At the first available opportunity, she got Larry into a corner. Disgusting, she said in a vibrant whisper. Did you hear what she's had? And you call her a friend? Friend? Said Larry in surprise. Why, I hardly know her. Can't stand the woman. But she's an interesting character, and I wanted to study her at close hand. I like that, said Mother indignantly. So you invite that creature here, and we all catch some revolting disease while you take notes. No, I'm sorry, Larry, but she'll have to go. Oh, don't be silly, Mother, said Larry irritably. You can't catch it. Not unless you intend to share a bed with her. Don't be revolting, said Mother, glaring. I won't stand that obscene person in this house. They argued in whispers for the rest of the day, but Mother was adamant. Eventually Larry suggested asking Theodore out and getting his opinion on the matter, and to this Mother agreed. So a note was dispatched asking Theodore to come out and spend the day. His reply accepting the invitation was brought by a carriage in which reclined the cloak-swathed form of Zatopech, who, it turned out, had drunk a farewell of prodigious size to Corfu, got on the wrong boat, and ended up in Athens. As by then he'd missed his appointment in Bosnia, he had philosophically boarded the next vessel back to Corfu, bringing with him several crates of wine. Theodore turned up the next day, wearing, as a concession to summer, a Panama instead of his usual Homburg. Before Mother had a chance to warn him about our hairless guest, Larry had introduced them. A doctor, said Melanie, Countess de Toro, her eyes gleaming. "How interesting. Perhaps you can advise me. I've just had erysipelas." "Ah, aha, really?" said Theodore, eyeing her keenly. "Which, treatment did you have?" They embarked on a long and technical discussion with enthusiasm, and it was only the most determined efforts on Mother's part that got them away from what she still considered to be an indelicate subject. "Really, Theodore's as bad as that woman," she said to Larry. "I do try to be broad-minded, but there is a limit, and I don't think things like that should be discussed at tea." Later, Mother got Theodore alone, and the subject of the Countess's disease was explained. Mother was then stricken with a guilty conscience at having misjudged the woman, and was immensely affable to her for the rest of the day, even telling her to take her wig off if she felt the heat. The dinner that night was colourful and extraordinary, and I was so fascinated by the assembly of characters and the various conversations that I did not know which one to listen to with undivided attention. The lamps smoked gently and cast a warm honey-coloured light over the table, making the china and glass glitter and setting fire to the red wine as it splashed into the glasses. "But, dear boy, you have missed the meaning of it. Yes, yes, you have," Zatopech's voice booming out, his nose curving over his wine-glass. "You cannot discuss poetry as if it were house painting." So I says to him, "I'm not doing a bleeding drawing for less than a tenner a time, so that's dirt cheap," I says. And the next morning I was paralysed, shocked beyond everything, thousands of blossoms bruised and torn. I say, I will never paint again. My nerves have been shattered, the whole orchard gone, whit, like that. And there was I. And then, of course, I had the sulphur baths. "Ah, yes, though, mind you, I think the bath treatment is a little, a little overrated. I believe that 92% of sufferers." The plates of food, piled like volcanoes, steamed gently. The early fruit in a polished pile in the centre dish, Lugaretzia hobbling around the table, groaning gently to herself, Theodore's beard twinkling in the lamplight, Leslie carefully manufacturing bread pellets to shoot at a moth that hovered around the lamps, Mother ladling out the food, smiling vaguely at everyone and keeping a watchful eye on Lugaretzia. Under the table, Roger's cold nose pressed hard against my knee in mute appeal. Margot and the still wheezing Michael discussing art. But then I think that Lawrence does that sort of thing so much better. He has a certain rich bloom, as it were. Don't you agree? I mean, take Lady Chatterley, eh? Oh, yes, quite. And then he did wonderful things in the desert, didn't he? And writing that wonderful book, the 7 Pillows of Wisdom, or whatever it was called. Larry and the Countess discussing art. "But you must have the straightforward simplicity, the clarity of a child's eyes. Take the finest fundamental verse, take Humpty Dumpty. Now there's poetry for you. The simplicity and freedom from cliches and outdated shibboleths." But then it's useless prating about the simple approach to poetry if you're going to produce jingles which are about as straightforward and uncomplicated as a camel's stomach. Mother and Durant. "And you can imagine the effect it had on me. I was shattered." "Yes, you must have been. Such a shame after all that trouble. Will you have a little more rice?" Jonquil and Theodore. "And the Latvian peasants, well, I've never seen anything like it." "Yes, here in Corfu, and I believe in some parts of Albania, the peasants have a very similar custom." Outside, the moon's face was peering through a filigree of vine leaves, and the owls were giving their strange chiming cries. Coffee and wine were served on the balcony, between the vine-shaggy pillars. Larry strummed on the guitar and sang an Elizabethan marching song. This reminded Theodore of one of his fantastic but true Corfu anecdotes, which he related to us with impish glee. "As you know, here in Corfu, nothing is ever done the correct way. Everyone starts out with the best intentions, but something always seems to go wrong. When the Greek king visited the island some years ago, the climax of his tour was to be a sort of stage show, a play. The climax of the drama was the Battle of the Thermopylae, and as the curtain fell, the Greek army was supposed to drive the Persian army triumphantly into the what do you call them? Yes, the wings. Well, it appears that the people playing the part of the Persians were a bit disgruntled at the thought of having to retreat in front of the king, and the fact that they had to play the part of Persians also, rankled. It only required a little incident to set things off. Unfortunately, during the battle scene, the leader of the Greek army misjudged the distance and caught the leader of the Persian army quite a heavy blow with his sword, his wooden sword. This, of course, was an accident. I mean to say, the poor fellow didn't mean to do it, but nevertheless, it was sufficient to inflame the Persian army to such an extent that instead of retreating, they advanced. The centre of the stage became a milling mob of helmeted soldiers locked in mortal combat. Two of them were thrown into the orchestra pit before someone had the sense to lower the curtain. The king remarked later that he had been greatly impressed by the realism shown in the battle scene. The burst of laughter sent the pale geckos scuttling up the wall in alarm. "Theodore," Larry laughed mockingly, "I'm sure you made that up." "No, no," Theodore would protest. "It's quite true. I saw it myself." "It sounds like the most unlikely story." "Here in Corfu," said Theodore, his eyes twinkling with pride, "anything can happen." The sea striped with moonlight gleamed through the olives. Down by the well the tree frogs croaked excitedly to each other. Two owls were having a contest in the tree below the veranda. In the grapevine above our heads, the geckos crept along the gnarled branches, eagerly watching the drifts of insects that were drawn, like a tide, by the lamplight.